So here's I think there's a point, there's a key thing here. One of the bigger problems here is almost 80% of the guns that shouldn't be out there, aside from gun shows, come from these, illegal dealers. The problem is that not illegal dealers, bad dealers, right? I think you had Bullseye down in Tacoma and a number of deals. Most dealers are good. Gun dealers are good. Let me finish. But the NRA has all but neutered the ATF. All but neutered. And there are, we haven't had an ATF director for the last 10 years. We haven't had an ATF director for the last 10 years because the NRA won't even allow us to have a Surgeon General because the guy wanted common sense gun control.
Well, the ATF is a little bit busy smuggling guns south of the border to the drug cartels.
Oh, come on. Unanimously, we agreed to the concept of background checks.
Ben?
I think that it's easy to move to the holistic when it really is just a problem of the human. The guns are a tool just like anything else. And the reality is that the states with the lowest gun homicide rate in the nations are, in order, New Hampshire, Vermont, Iowa, Idaho, North Dakota, and Montana. None of those states have significant gun laws. None of them. The reason for that is because the folks who live in those states are different than the folks who live in states with high rates of gun crime. If you actually want to solve the problem of gun crime, you have to solve the underlying problem with it, which is crime. Right? And instead of focusing on the implement that is used to commit the crime, we need to be focused on how we actually get the crime rates down. The truth is that one of the reasons that you've seen such tremendous declines in crime in some of the states that you mentioned, Ralph, is because across the country, we've seen a tremendous decline in the amount of crime in the country. We've actually seen tremendous declines in domestic violence, domestic assault across the country over the last 20 years. In terms of intimate partner violence, we've seen a decline of 72%. I mean, these are massive drops. And one of the reasons for that is not increased gun laws. Gun laws have actually been loosened in many cases, especially at the federal level. The reason for that is because you've actually seen longer sentences for criminals. I mean, if you keep criminals in prison, it turns out one of the benefits is that criminals are in prison.
Forcing it that way. I think we go round and round about statistics and trying to compare states. I don't think there's a social scientist in the world that says you can do a logical, controlled experiment determining whether a certain change in language saved lives or not. We don't know that. But what we do know is there are people who have these weapons and shouldn't. So why don't we just attack it from that point of view?
So it was understandable. Well, you were able to come down to, yes, you think that this is an effective way of reducing the odds that someone violent would get a gun. And that would,
well, it's better than doing
means.
Nothing. I mean, the only alternative is to say let's give up and accept.
Ben, is that the only alternative?
No, I don't think that's the only alternative. I don't understand why we don't have an alternative in terms of actually fighting crime itself. I mean, what we are doing is we are creating a whole new class of crime in which an enormous number of people who are not committing crimes other than transferring a weapon to, for example, a sister-in-law could theoretically be swept up by a prosecutor in that. Now, we've been assured by people that they are not going to apply the law as written in cases where they don't feel that it's necessary to do so. But really, I mean, this initiative is vague. It is poorly defined. The definitions are poor. There are many holes in it. And the best that the state seems to be doing with I-94 is, well, trust us, we'll enforce it right. And if that were the case, if that were the case, if we could trust the state to enforce things correctly, then we wouldn't have half of the problems with violence in the state that we currently have.
Okay, forget 594. What do you want to do?
What do I want to do? Okay.
How would you change the enforcement of crime to
longer sentences for criminals?
And regardless of...
Not at all sure that in fact, I sincerely doubt that it's gone down more in the 16 states with background checks. It's gone down nationwide. There isn't a state, not one state in the union where we don't have a dramatically lower homicide rate than we did in 1993. Why do you think?
It's totally demographics. It's totally demographics.
It's better policing.
No,
we are because
you look at every society, and gun violence is tied to testosterone level, and absolutely. And as we have an aging male demographic, then we have lower gun violence. You look at every society that's an aging demographic. Look at Japan, one of the oldest demographics. Gun violence is almost non-existent. Now they also don't have any guns there, but everything else being the same. Everything else being the same, you can look at state by state where the demographics get older, you see less violence of all kinds.
Ralph, since
That's too
just a
broad.
second, Ralph,
That's too broad. Not all young people are created the same.
Ralph, since you brought up Japan,
but
doesn't
wait.
Japan have a higher suicide rate than the United States overall?
I don't think they do.
They do.
No,
So does Sweden.
No, there's nuance there. They have a higher suicide attempt. They don't have a higher
No,
suicide.
they have a higher suicide death rate. So does Sweden. The United States is not by any means. We have a cascading suicide rate, and it's going up very dramatically. But the idea that there are all these nations like Sweden and Norway that have very high suicide rates, despite very strict, well, Norway does not have such strict gun controls, but Sweden does. And the point is that it seems to me that at the very heart of this, and what bothers me about this whole debate, and I had confided to folks before it, I find these debates frustrating sometimes, because there seems to be, and you'll pardon me, a naive faith that you can fix stuff materially. In other words, with crime, it's not the people. Those are flesh and blood, human souls. It's the thing, it's the gun. A gun is neither good or bad. A gun in the hands of somebody defending his family is a positive good. A gun in the hand of somebody attacking that family is evil. But it's not the thing itself, it's the way it's used, it's the hands it falls into, and we ought to concentrate on people, not things.
This is for youth who are caught with underage youth to have guns to be penalized and keep guns away from them. And we couldn't get that passed. I mean, that's political dysfunction that is really at the heart of this to a large degree.
Well, I mean, I agree there's political dysfunction. What I don't understand is why gun control is always the #1 agenda item. I mean, everyone on this stage basically agrees on mental health. I think everybody on the stage basically agrees on more penalties for people who commit serious crimes. Why is it that these things are secondary, but when it comes to gun confiscation or gun transfer or regulation thereof, which I think we all have to admit is at the margins. Okay, the evidence shows this is the best case for background checks shows that the evidence is mixed.
Okay.
That is the best case for background checks. Why are we messing around at the margins when the heart of the issue is really all these other issues that we're talking about?
We agree on that. But here's why I wish it was #1 on the agenda, but I wish it was in a pragmatic way. But here's the issue. More people now die from gun violence in the state than die from car accidents. And there are
80% of that suicide.
But suicide matters.
I agree suicide matters, but the suggestion that guns are responsible for suicide as opposed to the person whose finger is on the trigger of the gun is absurd to me.
Well, when you get a 34% efficacy rate versus 2% for non-guns, and the majority of suicides are done by firearms, I think guns and suicide are a toxic mix.
Well, if you're mentally ill, you shouldn't have a gun in the first place, so we're back to mental illness.
We agree.
So, Ralph, let me ask this. Why does I-94 have to be an omnibus? Really, it's an 18-page bill. If we agree on all of these very minor measures, then why not start with the minor measures upon which we agree? Why is it loaded up like a shopping cart with measures with which a lot of people disagree?
What do you think it's loaded up? We're going to get into transfers, right?
Well, yes. I mean, the definition, I mean, I don't want to get into the weeds because we talked about this earlier, but yes, the definition of transfer is incredibly vague in the bill.
So a couple of things about transfers on that. And one, this bill was modeled after Oregon and California, which have had...
Being from California, it's worked beautifully.
Which has had hundreds of thousands of background checks, and there hasn't been one instance of somebody put in jail for a transfer. Secondly, the key thing on a transfer is that you have to knowingly circumvent the law. In other words, you have to be a black market dealer. Or otherwise, you're not going to be criminalized for it. That transfer issue is put in there to affect this individual at a gun show. So gun shows are private sales. You can sell a couple of guns, but you had black market dealers that were selling 50 AK-47s a session against the law. Those people should have been, by definition, federally licensed firearm dealers. So it's designed at some point to prevent the bad guys from doing it. It's not a gotcha. Nobody wants gotcha for the average everyday citizen put in jail, and it will not happen that way because we have precedent in California and Oregon.
Well, it should be, okay, let me tell you a little bit about the precedent in California California for a second? In California, there are 30,000 mentally ill people who have guns. They have a grand total of 33 people, really, in the state of California who are tasked with taking these 30,000 guns away from these 30,000 mentally ill people. Okay, we're creating a system that is either not going to be enforced or it's going to be over-enforced. This idea, if we can just trust the government, then why aren't we just trusting the government to do the right thing now? I don't understand why a piece of legislation makes them better at what they do. I mean, the government is not very good at what they're doing now. Why does new wording make them not suck?
Because part of the reason you have a law or initiative as a deterrent, that government won't even be involved, that the bad guys won't be going to gun shows to buy guns, so they have to circumvent it.
Well, but that's exactly the point. If bad guys are not going to gun shows with regard to Ebola, and for a second, this is a mild digression. With regard to Ebola, the federal government just made the case that they don't want a federal travel ban, right? Because they said if there's a federal travel ban, people will just find a way to circumvent the federal travel ban. Okay, do you see the analogy here?
Yeah, I'm not going there. I'm not going there.
But here's part of the, Ralph, you cited the fact that there are not this many break-ins in the United States where you need a gun. One of the reasons is because everybody owns a gun in the United States. If you look at the number of hot break-ins, for example, in the United States versus Britain, half of the break-ins in Great Britain, where there's pretty much zero gun ownership, the rate of robbery when somebody is at home is 50%. 50% of the break-ins occur when somebody is at home because they know they're not going to encounter somebody with a gun. The rate in the United States is 10%. That's because you may open the door and there may be something you don't like on the other side of it. Just because this is interesting more than anything else, out of intellectual curiosity, is everybody basically willing to concede that the American government at no point at any time in the future will ever start encroaching on the rights of Americans? Is that the idea here?
No, Ben. But what I am find it necessary to affirm
arguing in 2014 is not the same as saying that we need the guns for a purpose.
See, this is where I disagree with you. I do not believe that the founders wanted, or that we should want, or favor the idea that if the federal government begins encroaching on the rights of the Americans, you don't resist it with firearms. You resist it with political activism, and you resist it by changing the government.
I fully agree. And then if it doesn't work,
and then if it doesn't work, basically we're screwed.
We're all screwed.
Yeah.